3 years ago, we didn't need anybody. We're going to shortly be energy dominant. We're going to make so much money. We're going to pay off debt. The $35 trillion in debt, we're going to pay it off. We're going to get it done fast, too.
When you hear the number $36 trillion, it's easy to feel like a statistic that's just too big to grasp. But the reality is that's the current size of the U.S. national debt, and it's been growing for decades. To put it in perspective, if you stacked $1 bills on top of each other, $36 trillion would reach all the way to the moon and back, several times. It's a lot of money, and believe me, it's something that affects all of us in one way or another. I'll talk about this in just a minute. What's worse is that the debt interest payments have now grown too, recently crossing the $1.1 trillion mark. This figure is more than the GDP of Sweden and Belgium combined. Imagine that. Whether you're paying taxes, receiving government benefits, or simply living in a world where inflation impacts prices, the national debt is a part of your daily life. What many US citizens also don't understand is that the debt and its interest payments grow. That means your precious tax dollars aren't going to your community or country, but to debt holders like China, who America owes money to. Yes, that means that your taxpayer dollars are funding the CCP's plans. And that's exactly why the growing US debt has been such a point of focus in recent years. Now that President Donald Trump is in office, he's made it his top priority to eliminate national debt. One of his election promises was to reduce the national debt, and now that he has the power to, President Trump's proposed a plan to stop this debt from rising any further. From extensive tax cuts to establishing the Department of Government Efficiency, Trump's plans promise fireworks throughout his term. But as with any political strategy, the question remains, can these proposals really reduce debt in the long term? Or are they just short-term fixes that end up making the problem worse? Let's explore Trump's approach to the US debt and see whether his plan holds any real promise for tackling this ever-growing issue. First off, let's talk about how the United States got into this multi-trillion-dollar mess. The US debt didn't just appear overnight. It's been building up over many years, through different administrations and economic cycles. Think of it like a snowball rolling down a hill, getting bigger and bigger as it goes. The US government has been borrowing money to cover its expenses for a long time, and this borrowing's added up to a pretty hefty sum. To make this issue clearer, I'll split it into a why and how problem. Why does the US have debt, and how does the mechanics of a country having debt even work? You must admit, it's weird saying the world's most powerful nation owes money. Let's start with the first part. Why does the government need to borrow money in the first place? As you might have guessed, the government borrows money when its revenue isn't enough to cover its expenses. These expenses are all important things, but they come with a hefty price tag that the government doesn't always afford. It's kind of like how we might use a credit card to cover expenses when we don't have enough cash on hand. So, if after adding up all the national income sources like taxes, the government expenses are higher, then a budget deficit occurs. The government then looks for money to compensate for that difference. One of the main reasons the US debt has grown so much is the excessive government spending. Simply put, the US spends way too much. The government spends money on a wide range of things, from defense and infrastructure to social programs and healthcare. While these are all important areas, the spending can sometimes get out of hand, leading to higher deficits and higher debt levels. For example, defense spending is a significant part of the US budget. The US has by far the strongest military in the world, and maintaining such a large military force is expensive. So naturally, it also has the largest military budget in the world. For 2025, the military budget stands at $850 billion. That's just mind-blowing, isn't it? This includes costs for personnel, equipment, research and development, and more. While national security is crucial, the high cost of defense can contribute to the growing debt. If there's not enough money to cover this, well, the US borrows. Another area of significant spending is social programs. In 2024 alone, the United States spent approximately $671 billion on social programs. These include things like Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. These programs provide essential support to millions of Americans, but they also come with a huge price tag. As the population ages and healthcare costs continue to rise, the cost of these programs is expected to increase even further, adding to the debt. This makes the future of America worrisome. Infrastructure is another critical area of spending. The government invests in building and maintaining roads, bridges, airports, and other infrastructure projects. These investments are necessary for economic growth and public safety, but they also require substantial funding. In 2021, the Biden administration, through the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, allocated $1.2 trillion to infrastructure developments. This was to be spread over a few years. In 2024, approximately $378.6 billion of this was spent. That's a pretty penny. When you started to add up everything that needed money versus the money that was there, you come up with a deficit. That's how in 2024, the United States national debt increased by approximately $2.3 trillion. But the national debt is not just from one year. Since 2000, the US government has consistently run budget deficits, meaning it's spent more money than it's collected in revenue. This has led to an increase in the national debt over time. From where it is now, measured against the size of the US economy, the debt's approaching a record high set in the final year of World War II. Crazy, right? Over the years, the US has faced various economic challenges that have also contributed to the debt. For example, during times of recession, the government often increases spending to stimulate the economy and help people who are struggling. This has led to higher debt levels. One such challenging time in the history of US debt was the Great Recession of 2008. This was a major economic downturn that led to a significant increase in government spending. The government implemented various stimulus measures to try and boost the economy, and this added to the debt. It was a tough time for a lot of people, and the government's response was aimed at preventing an even deeper economic crisis. More recently, the COVID-19 pandemic also had a huge impact on the US economy, and the government's response to it added to the debt. To support individuals and businesses during the pandemic, the government implemented various relief measures, such as stimulus checks, unemployment benefits, and small business loans. I'm sure you still remember those checks. These measures were necessary to help people get through a tough time, but they also came with a cost. Fast forward to today, and the US debt has reached new heights. As of February 2025, the national debt has hit $36 trillion, less than 4 months after surpassing the $35 trillion mark. That's a pretty mind-boggling number and even more shocking pace of growth. To put it in perspective, one source stated that if you stacked $1 bills on top of each other, $36 trillion would reach all the way to the moon and back several times. It's a lot of money, and believe me, it's something that affects all of us in one way or another. I'll talk about this in just a minute. With the why out of the way, let's answer the how. How does the US government borrow money to cover these expenses we've discussed? Let's make the connection. One of the primary ways this happens is through the issuance of bonds. When the government needs to borrow money, it sells bonds to investors. These bonds are essentially IOUs, where the government promises to pay back the borrowed amount with interest at a later date. Investors, including individuals, corporations, and foreign governments, buy these bonds as a relatively safe investment. There are different types of government bonds, including treasury bills, notes, and bonds. Treasury bills are short-term bonds that mature in a year or less, while treasury notes have maturities ranging from 2 to 10 years. Treasury bonds are long-term bonds with maturities of 20 to 30 years. The government pays interest on these bonds, which adds to the overall cost of borrowing. The interest rates on government bonds can vary based on factors like the overall economic environment and the government's credit rating. When interest rates are low, borrowing's cheaper for the government. However, when interest rates rise, the cost of borrowing increases, adding to the debt burden. In addition to bonds, the government can also borrow money from other sources, such as foreign governments and international organizations. For example, countries like China and Japan hold significant amounts of US debt. This means that the US owes money to these countries, and they've a vested interest in the stability of the US economy. As I touched on at the beginning of the video, China holds a significant portion of US debt, and this has been an important part of the financial relationship between the two countries for many years. Essentially, China's bought a lot of US government bonds, also known as treasury securities, as a way to invest the large amounts of US dollars it earns from its trade surplus with the US. Here's how it all came about. China exports more to the US than it imports, so it ends up with a lot of US dollars. Now, a normal person would sell the dollars to buy their local currency, but China doesn't want to do that because if you buy yuan, it increases yuan value relatively to the dollar, which in turn makes Chinese exports more expensive. So instead of just holding on to all that cash, China buys the US Treasury bonds because they're considered a safe investment. Treasury bonds are backed by the US government, so they're very low risk. Currently, China holds close to $1 trillion of US debt, which is a big chunk of the US national debt. While this number fluctuates, it's consistently made China the second largest foreign holder of US debt, right after Japan. To put it into perspective, foreign countries hold about $7.5 trillion of US debt, and China's share is around 13 to 15% of that total. So, why does this matter? For one, it creates an economic interdependence between China and the US. China's investments in US debt help the US government keep borrowing costs low, which is important for financing things like public services, military spending, and infrastructure. The US benefits from these low interest rates, and China benefits from earning interest on its investments. However, there's also a lot of political and economic power wrapped up in this relationship. Because China holds so much US debt, some people worry that China could use this as leverage. For example, if China decided to suddenly sell off its US Treasury bonds as it did in November last year, it could cause US interest rates to rise and make it more expensive for the US to borrow money. This would hurt the US economy. But China's been careful not to overdo that because it would hurt their own financial interests too. Selling off extremely large amounts of US debt would likely cause the value of the remaining bonds to drop, making China's remaining investments lose value. But the situation isn't just about economics. There's also a geopolitical side to things. As tensions rise between the US and China, especially over trade, military issues, and things like the South China Sea, it raises the question of whether China might use its holdings of US debt as a political tool. While there's no evidence that China's used this debt as a bargaining chip, it's something to keep an eye on as the two countries continue to navigate their relationship. As we talk about China and the US, I know it's tempting to think of all this as a national issue that'll play out geopolitically. You might even think, well, if we owe $36 trillion and nothing bad has happened, we're in the clear, right? Wrong. There are many problems with the growing national debt. Let's bring it to a relatable level and analyze the impact of the national debt on the average citizen. For one, it can lead to higher interest rates. When the government borrows a lot of money, it can drive up interest rates for everyone. This means that things like mortgages, car loans, and credit card interest rates can go up, making it more expensive for us to borrow money. That no doubt hurts you and your family the most. Another impact of high debt levels is that it can limit the government's ability to respond to future economic crises. If the government's already heavily in debt, it might not have as much flexibility to increase spending when it's most needed. This can make it harder to address issues like unemployment, healthcare, and infrastructure in the future. Ultimately, this means that people who are supposed to receive help from the government don't, and they suffer badly. This is particularly dangerous in healthcare matters, as people can quite literally die because the government has no money and is in deep debt. On top of all this, the debt creates a long-term burden for future generations. If the debt keeps growing, future Americans will be left to deal with the consequences. Whether it's higher taxes, reduced public services, or an economic slowdown, the weight of this debt will impact everyone. This is quite unfair, as it means that America's future can be damaged by today's actions, as we leave behind a dysfunctional country all because of poor financial decisions. This is why solving the national debt crisis is so critical. So you see, the US debt issue is a very complicated and sensitive one. Addressing it will require a combination of strategies. It's a complex issue with no easy solutions, but understanding the background and the factors that contribute to the debt is a crucial first step. With that understanding out of the way, let's talk about President Donald Trump and his bold plan to tackle the debt problem.
How critical is an issue is the national debt, and how specifically would you try to bring that down if you're reelected?
Well, the way you bring it down is through really great growth. Also, you bring it down with tariffs because these countries are making all of our product. You know, when you have a 100% tariff on a nation, better than the money is the fact that they're not going to want to pay it very long and they're going to build a plant here. If they build a plant here, there is no tariff. So we're going to do it through growth. We're going to have very rapid growth, and we're going to do it. We're going to do it quickly and effectively, and it's going to make a lot of money. And we're going to start paying down our debt. We have to pay. We have to start paying down our debt.
Throughout his election campaign and on his way to office, Donald Trump has talked about an economic plan that he'll use to get rid of America's debt. This plan consists of three main elements: cut taxes, reduce government spending, and economic growth strategies. Each of these components plays a crucial role in his overall approach to reducing the US debt. Let's take a closer look at each one, starting with tax cuts. One of the key components of Trump's plan is to reduce taxes. The core idea behind this plan is that by cutting taxes, both individuals and businesses will have more money to spend and invest. This, in turn, is expected to stimulate economic growth in the US. The logic here is that when people have more disposable income, they tend to spend more on goods and services. Similarly, when businesses have lower tax burdens, they can invest more in expansion, hiring, and innovation. This increased economic activity will generate more revenue for the government, even with the lower tax rates. As government revenue increases, this will eliminate the need for borrowing money.
So, ladies and gentlemen, go on. We're going to put it straight. We're going to give tremendous incentive like no other country has. We're cutting your taxes. We're going to cut them very substantially. We got them down to 21% from probably 42 or 44%, depending on where you are. And we got them down to 21. Everyone said that was a miracle. Now we're getting them down to 15, but only if you make your product here. Otherwise, you pay 21, which is not bad. It's in the middle of the pack, but 15 brings you down to among the lowest.
One of the main components of Trump's tax plan is to lower the corporate tax rate. During his first term, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, or TCJA, reduced the corporate tax rate from 35% to 21%. Trump has proposed further reducing this rate to 20% or even 15%. The idea is that lower corporate taxes will make the US a more attractive place for businesses to operate, encouraging both domestic and foreign companies to invest and create jobs in the US. Trump's plan also includes significant tax cuts for individuals. The TCJA already lowered individual income tax rates and increased the standard deduction. Trump's proposed extending these cuts and making them permanent. Additionally, he's suggested eliminating taxes on Social Security benefits, tips, and overtime wages. The goal here is to put more money in the pockets of working and middle-class Americans, boosting consumer spending and driving economic growth. The key assumption of Trump's plan is that the economic growth generated by these tax cuts will lead to higher government revenue in the long run. This is based on the idea of supply-side economics, which suggests that lower tax rates can lead to increased economic activity and ultimately higher tax revenue. In theory, the increased revenue from a growing economy would offset the initial loss in revenue from the tax cuts, helping to reduce the national debt in the long run. However, as you might imagine, not everyone agrees with this approach. Some economists worry that the tax cuts could lead to a significant increase in the deficit in the short term. They've gone as far as to state that Trump's plans will cost America trillions of dollars in the years to come. You see, if the economic growth generated by the tax cuts isn't enough to offset the loss in revenue, the government could end up with a larger deficit and higher debt levels. This is a major concern, as the national debt is already at record levels. This shows the big risk that comes with Trump's plan. Another potential risk is that the benefits of the tax cuts may not be evenly distributed. Critics argue that the tax cuts unequally benefit the wealthy and large corporations, while providing less relief to low and middle-income individuals. This could lead to increased income inequity and social unrest. In trying to solve an economic problem, Trump and his administration might just create a social one. Next, let's talk about reducing government spending, which is another key component of Trump's plan to reduce US debt. First off, Trump aims to reduce government spending by targeting discretionary spending. This includes areas like education, transportation, and housing. The idea is to cut back on these expenses to save money and reduce the debt. It's a bit like tightening your belt when you're trying to save money. For example, by reducing funding for certain education programs or infrastructure projects, the government can save billions of dollars. However, it's important to note that these cuts can have significant impacts on the quality of services and programs that many Americans rely on. For instance, cutting education funding could affect the quality of education and limit opportunities for students. Another major component of Trump's plan is to make changes to entitlement programs like Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. These programs provide essential support to millions of Americans, but they also come with a hefty price tag. Trump has suggested making changes to these programs to reduce their costs. For example, he's proposed raising the retirement age for Social Security, or changing the way that benefits are calculated. These changes could save the government a significant amount of money, but they could also impact the financial security of many Americans who rely on these programs. For instance, raising the retirement age could mean that people have to work longer before they can access their benefits. Trump's also proposed the creation of a new department focused on improving government efficiency. This is where the Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE, comes into play. The idea here is that by streamlining government operations and eliminating waste, the government can save money and reduce the debt. It's a bit like cleaning out your closet and getting rid of things you don't need. The Department of Government Efficiency would be responsible for identifying areas where the government can cut costs and improve efficiency. This could include things like reducing administrative overhead, consolidating programs, and eliminating redundant services. The goal is to make the government more efficient and effective, while also saving money.
Through the Department of Government Efficiency, Elon Musk has been working very hard with various people, including Vivek. We're going to eliminate hundreds of billions of dollars of waste and fraud. And I can only tell you, I'll give you a little early report, they're finding things that you wouldn't even believe. So we're looking to save maybe $2 trillion, and it'll have no impact. Actually, it'll make life better, but it'll have no impact on people. It's not like we will never cut Social Security, things like that. It's just waste, fraud, and abuse.
One interesting aspect of this plan is the involvement of Elon Musk. Trump's having Elon Musk lead the department and make the government more efficient. Trump wants Musk to use his expertise in areas like automation and artificial intelligence to streamline government operations and reduce costs. For example, Musk's companies like Tesla and SpaceX have been at the forefront of developing new technologies and finding innovative solutions to complex problems. For example, Musk's companies like Tesla and SpaceX have been at the forefront of developing new technologies and finding innovative solutions to complex problems. By leveraging this expertise, the government will potentially find new ways to improve efficiency and save money. It's a bit like bringing in a tech guru to help you organize your life and make things run more smoothly. On top of his capable qualifications, Musk has been a big supporter of Trump and even contributed to his campaign, donating over $238 million to Trump's campaign. When the plan for Doge was set up, Vivek Ramaswamy was supposed to co-lead, but he left before things really got going. Now it's just Musk at the helm, using his tech-savvy brain to whip the government into shape.
I kind of like Doge. It's more fun. Where we just take a look at all the federal agencies and say, do we really need whatever it is, 428 federal agencies? Like, if there's so many that people have never even heard of, and that have overlapping areas of responsibility, we should, I don't know, we should get, I mean, there are more federal agencies than there are years since the establishment of the United States, which means that we've created more than one federal agency per year on average. That seems a lot.
That's a lot.
That's a lot. So we should have, that seems crazy. I think we should be able to get away with 99 agencies. I don't know. That seems a lot like a lot of agencies.
It's a lot. Yeah. 2 per state. That's a lot.
Yeah, exactly. We should have fewer agencies, and they certainly shouldn't have overlapping responsibilities. And then we need some kind of, we just need a review of regulations to say which ones are sensible and which ones are not. Because if you've got regulators, every year they're going to add more regulations, just automatic. Like they just output regulations. And there's more laws and regulations every year until basically everything's legal, so we can't get anything done. So we need some kind of garbage collection for regulations that don't make sense. I think I'm saying very obvious things.
You are saying obvious things.
Yeah. So
which will be very unpopular things.
Yeah. I'll probably need, if this happens, quite a significant security team. So that, because someone might literally go postal on me from the post office.
Doge is also looking at reducing the number of federal agencies. Right now, there are over 400 agencies, and they're hoping to cut that number down to fewer than 100. This could mean consolidating programs, eliminating redundant services, and even laying off some federal employees. It's a pretty ambitious plan, but the goal is to make the government more efficient and effective while saving a ton of money. Of course, there are some potential challenges and risks with this plan. One issue is the potential conflict of interest, since Musk owns several government-subsidized businesses like SpaceX and Tesla, which get military contracts and tradable carbon credits. There's also the risk of job losses and layoffs among federal employees, which could create a lot of backlash and resistance. Another part of Trump's plan involves reducing the size of the federal workforce. By cutting the number of federal employees, the government can save money on salaries, benefits, and other expenses. This could involve eliminating certain positions, consolidating roles, or outsourcing certain functions to the private sector. As of February 2025, Trump's already signed an executive order that impacts federal workers. One of his first actions upon taking office was to issue an order that halts the hiring of new federal workers. Additionally, he's mandated that all federal workers return to their offices full-time, ending the work-from-home policies that were implemented during the COVID-19 pandemic. However, it's important to consider the potential impacts of these cuts on the quality and availability of government services. For example, reducing the number of employees in critical areas like healthcare or public safety could lead to longer wait times and reduced access to services. Trump's also proposed cutting back on foreign aid and other international spending. The idea here is that by reducing the amount of money the US spends on foreign aid, the government can save money and reduce the debt. Since assuming office, he's backed his words by cutting aid to other countries. This move is part of his America First agenda, aiming to prioritize domestic needs over international assistance. Shortly after taking office, Trump announced a temporary freeze on almost all foreign aid. This decision paused billions of dollars in global funding, with the idea that the US should not blindly dole out money with no return for the American people. The freeze affects a wide range of programs, including those supporting health, education, development, and security assistance. This decision has sent shockwaves across the world, with aid groups warning that it could put lives at risk. For example, clinics that provide life-saving medicine and treatments might have to shut down, leaving people without essential health care. But because the US spends billions of dollars on aid, Trump's determined to cut costs everywhere he can. However, it's important to consider the potential impacts of these cuts on international relations and global stability. For instance, cutting foreign aid could weaken alliances and reduce the US's influence on the global stage. Finally, let's talk about economic growth strategies, which is the third key component of Trump's plan to stimulate economic growth. The idea here is that by boosting the economy, the government will generate more revenue and reduce the debt. It's a bit like planting seeds and watching them grow. So how exactly does Trump plan to stimulate economic growth? Well, there are a few different strategies that he's proposed. One of the main strategies is to reduce regulations. By reducing the number of regulations that businesses have to comply with, the idea is to make it easier for them to operate and grow. This can lead to increased investment and job creation, which in turn can stimulate economic growth. For example, by cutting back on environmental regulations, businesses and industries like manufacturing and energy can operate more freely and potentially increase their output. Trump's so serious about this that on the 1st of February, he signed an executive order that requires 10 regulations to be eliminated for each one that's added. By doing so, he's guaranteed that regulations will be kept in check.
Okay, we're signing a regulation bill, and you might want to discuss it, please. Somebody could explain it.
This is an executive order called Unleashing Prosperity Through Deregulation. So it slashes unnecessary regulations, which will put more money in Americans' pockets, unleash economic growth, and guarantee that the United States of America remains the strongest competitor on the world market. And in order to achieve that, this order requires a rigorous regulatory budget process. So for each new regulation issued, at least 10 prior regulations will be identified for elimination.
So 1 for 10.
Pretty interesting, right? Trump's also emphasized the importance of energy independence. By increasing domestic energy production, the goal is to reduce reliance on foreign energy sources and boost the economy. This strategy includes promoting the drill baby drill approach to increase oil and gas production. The idea is that by producing more energy domestically, the US can create jobs, reduce energy costs, and stimulate economic growth. Another part of Trump's plan involves investing in infrastructure. By rebuilding roads, bridges, airports, and other critical infrastructure, the goal is to create jobs and stimulate economic growth. Infrastructure projects can have a multiplier effect on the economy, as they create jobs not only in construction, but also in related industries like manufacturing and services. Trump also aims to renegotiate trade deals to make them more favorable to the US. The idea is that by securing better trade deals, the US can increase exports, reduce the trade deficit, and stimulate economic growth. For example, by renegotiating NAFTA and other trade agreements, the goal is to create more jobs and increase economic activity in the US. Trump's strategy involves posing tariffs on imports from other countries, like China, Mexico, and Canada. The idea is that these tariffs will make imported goods more expensive, encouraging consumers and businesses to buy American-made products instead. This can help boost domestic production, create jobs, and stimulate economic growth. To stand by his word, as of February 2025, Trump imposed a levy of 25% on Canadian and Mexican imports, as well as an additional 10% tax on Chinese goods. Canadian Energy faces a lower 10% tariff. It's important to to note that these particular tariffs, however, weren't just a part of Trump's tax plan, but they were also there to inspire China, Canada, and Mexico to do something about the drugs that kept coming into America via these countries' channels. They still, however, display the utility of tariffs. By increasing demand for American-made goods, tariffs can lead to higher revenues for U.S. companies. These companies, in turn, pay more taxes to the government, which can help reduce the budget deficit and, ultimately, the national debt. Additionally, tariffs can generate direct revenue for the government, as importers have to pay the tariffs when bringing goods into the country. However, it's important to note that tariffs can also have some negative effects. They can lead to higher prices for consumers, as businesses pass on the increased cost of imported goods. This can reduce consumer spending and potentially slow down economic growth. Moreover, other countries might retaliate by imposing their own tariffs on U.S. exports, which can hurt American businesses and workers. Canada, for one, on the 2nd of February announced a 25% retaliatory tariff on $155 billion of American goods. This ever-escalating tension might result in a trade war.
Unfortunately, the actions taken today by the White House split us apart instead of bringing us together. Tonight, I am announcing Canada will be responding to the U.S. trade action with 25% tariffs against $155 billion worth of American goods.
Now that we've discussed Trump's plans and their drawbacks, let's compare them to other proposed solutions. Because it's such a big topic, several other solutions have been proposed to tackle this debt problem. Let's consider the pros and cons of each. One alternative approach is to focus on increasing government revenue through tax increases. This could involve raising income tax rates, corporate tax rates, or other forms of taxation. The idea here is that by increasing revenue, the government can reduce the deficit and pay down the debt. However, this approach can also have drawbacks. Higher taxes can impact economic growth and reduce disposable income for individuals and businesses. It's a bit like taking a bigger slice of pie, but leaving less for everyone else. Another approach is to focus on reducing government spending without cutting taxes. This could involve making targeted cuts to discretionary spending, entitlement programs, and other areas of the budget. The idea here is that by reducing spending, the government can save money and reduce the debt. However, this approach can also have drawbacks. Cutting spending can impact important programs and services, and it can be politically challenging to implement. It's a bit like tightening your belt but risking cutting off circulation. There are also hybrid approaches that combine elements of both tax increases and spending cuts. For example, some proposals suggested raising taxes on high-income individuals and corporations while making targeted cuts to government spending. The idea here is to balance the need for revenue with the need for spending reductions. However, this approach can also have drawbacks. It can be difficult to find the right balance, and there may be political resistance to both tax increases and spending cuts. It's a bit like trying to walk a tightrope. We also can't talk about Trump's plans for dealing with U.S. debt without touching on the debt ceiling issue. Just looking at this post from Trump shows how annoying of an issue it is for him. So, what is all this about? The debt ceiling is essentially a cap set by Congress on how much the federal government's allowed to borrow. This limit is meant to control the national debt and ensure that the government doesn't spend beyond its means. However, the government often runs a budget deficit, meaning it spends more than it collects in revenue. To cover this deficit, the government borrows money, which adds to the national debt. When the government reaches the debt ceiling, it can't borrow any more money unless Congress raises or suspends the limit. If the debt ceiling isn't raised, the government risks defaulting on its obligations, which could have severe economic consequences. For example, it might not be able to pay Social Security benefits, military salaries, or interest on the national debt. In recent years, the debt ceiling's become a contentious political issue. Lawmakers often use it as a bargaining chip to negotiate spending cuts or other policy changes. This has led to several high-stakes standoffs and last-minute deals to avoid default. For instance, in 2023, the debt ceiling was suspended through the Fiscal Responsibility Act, temporarily staving off an economic crisis. As of January 2025, the debt ceiling was reinstated at $36.1 trillion, and the Treasury Department has been using extraordinary measures to keep the government from defaulting. These measures include pausing payments to certain government accounts to meet more pressing obligations. However, these are only short-term solutions, and Congress will need to act to raise or suspend the debt ceiling to avoid a default. Because of all this, Trump has suggested that the debt ceiling should be abolished altogether. He argues that the debt ceiling is unnecessary because it's consistently raised and merely serves a psychological purpose. This is proven in that the U.S. has raised the debt ceiling 103 times since 1939. Trump's nominee for Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has expressed support for working with Congress to repeal the debt ceiling. By eliminating the debt ceiling, Trump believes that the government can avoid the recurring crisis crises and focus on long-term fiscal planning. In the big picture, if the government can successfully stimulate economic growth and cut spending, it may reduce the frequency of hitting the debt ceiling. This is because the overall borrowing needs to be lower, reducing the pressure to raise or suspend the debt limit. That would also eliminate a lot of headaches for Trump. However, if these strategies don't work as planned and the deficit remains high, the government will continue to hit the debt ceiling, leading to the same recurring issue of needing to raise or suspend it. It'll also be interesting to see how Trump's plans materialize. His term is just beginning, so there's still time for all this to be a huge success, or for it all to go wrong. Whichever way it goes, American citizens can be assured that they'll have a front row seat to the magic or the chaos.